Okay, we now move on to looking at immigration as an example of how to apply these developments of natural law from Finnis and Hoose. Okay, so immigration, what does that mean? It's the action of coming to live permanently in a foreign country, and this is looking at it from the perspective of those in the receiving country. So it's immigration, it's inward flow of people. And this is looked at from the position of, don't forget this is about for Finnis, this is very much about law, also to a large extent Hoose. This is looking at those people making laws in countries to say what sort of immigration controls, if any, should be in place. Some little case studies here. Which it's worth just pausing the video at the moment to have a look at these and see if you can rank them. Which of these would you think the receiving country would be? And we're looking at this in terms of Britain. Which of these would you say that Britain would be most willing to accept, and very importantly, why? And also which would be at the bottom of the list in terms of receiving them happily, and possibly even saying no, they can't come in. And at the moment, don't do this from a natural law position. Just look at your own thinking on this as a way of getting into some of the issues. Looking at some very general background points then, is this. So we're looking at small scale or mass immigration. And these are different. Small scale, and the immigrants can just very easily integrate into the home culture within a few generations at the longest. Mass immigration, now this is highly likely to lead to ghettos which preserve the immigrants' culture and prevent integration. Now if you've never seen these, it's difficult to imagine it, but there's where I used to live in Birmingham, lived there in the late 70s, so Balsall Heath and down one of the main arterial roads, the Ladypool Road. You could go there and nobody would speak English. The shops, it was just like going abroad. You would felt like a foreign country. The shops felt different. And it's quite a large area really, and completely different. All the signs were up in I can't remember what language, is probably Urdu, and all the signs on the shops were in that, and the shops have spilled out onto the pavement. Marvelous displays. You could buy food and fruit there that no idea what it was at times. You go into somewhere, you wanted something to eat, and so you'd go in and you'd point at things and then just put the money on your hand and hold it out to the person and just see what he took. It was a fairly safe bet really, because they didn't tend to take much, so it was it was a good way of eating very cheaply. But it just felt that was a significant area. We're not just talking about one or two roads. We're talking about quite a large area which was just its own culture, that its own Pakistani Islamic culture within that, and that's the sort of mass immigration model. Another very important one, migrants of the same language and culture as the indigenous population. So, for example, white Australians moving to UK will seamlessly fit in immediately. My last school, for a period of about 10 years or so, there was a policy of using Southern Hemisphere sports coaches, and so you go in the changing rooms, changing for games, and the PE staff, plenty of them were Australians, South Africans, New Zealanders, but they slotted in perfectly well. No meaningful differences at all. They brought their kids with them if they had them, and they just went into school. They just felt straight away pretty much at home, and so they just seamlessly fit in. Completely different. You've got some Bangladeshi Muslims who turn up, and it's just such a radical difference. Language is different, and not just slightly different. We're not talking about sort of French difference. We're talking about, you know, completely different scripts, different language, so different religion. Bangladeshi Muslims, well, they're Muslim, aren't they? Put that in the title. Skin colour, so they immediately look different. Marriage customs, a strong tradition of marrying first cousins, which we would find just pretty abhorrent, really. Role of women, the food they eat, and just, you know, simple things like, if, you know, they're coming from Bangladeshi, you know, very poor rural villages, and they, you know, there's no flush toilets and electricity in many of those areas, so just completely different. And so again, you know, they're going to turn up, and they're not going to fit in seamlessly. And if we link it to the mass or small scale, if those Bangladeshi Muslims then just join in to an existing, you know, well-established Bangladeshi community, I think Tower Hamlets is in London is Bangladeshi, you know, and they turn up there, they will just continue very much in their own way of working. They can live and work in their in the language and culture of Bangladesh. They, for their sons, they you know, get a wife from the back in the home village and bring them in, and so you're constantly maintaining the you know, the woman in the household, so the mother, which is very important for language development. The mother's constantly, doesn't matter how long the community is established, the mother in the household is still a rural Bangladeshi. And so as you look at that, these are general background points. And so when we talk about immigration, you can't just talk about it as is, because, you know, what are we looking at? Hence that exercise that we started with, to get some general feel for it. So these are some general background points we need to have in place as we now move in to the details of Finnis and Hoose. Let's start with Finnis then, and as is to be expected, as you look at Finnis and you look at his different lists, then you don't get a single, it's not a single simple, right, you go into a list, you find the law, yeah, there we go, we've got it, we know exactly what it is. You know, back to this repeated theme with Finnis, it's in that person-centered virtue ethics model. You know, boy, do you need some serious wisdom as you soak in his lists, reflect on those lists, ideally reflect on those lists with others. Don't forget, this is about law, and so you'd be expecting this to be panels of judges, politicians debating it. You'd expect it to be a corporate decision by the wise and mature leaders of the country, who are seriously engaging with the totality of the lists that Finnis puts forward. And as we go through this, it's fairly obvious that we're going to find that some of the elements in Finnis' list seem to support immigration, and some of them seem to oppose it. Okay, let's have a look at some of these then. So we've got friendship and sociability. Well, I can obviously support immigration. We should extend the hand of friendship to all, including immigrants. Aesthetic experience, immigration supports this, because it opens up a wider variety of cultural aesthetic influences, different types of art or poetry. I mean, going back to when I lived in Birmingham, living in Birmingham is the next best thing to a world tour, really. The Bullring Market in the centre of Birmingham was just amazing. The foods you could buy, the fabrics, and I've mentioned, you know, the Pakistani Muslim community in Balsall Heath. You've got the Afro-Caribbeans community in Handsworth. And so just a vibrant, I mean, music scene, just art and culture was in Birmingham was greatly enriched by that range of cultures. And it also gave you lots of festivals which you could dip into, as all these different cultures brought their festivals into the city. And religion, the idea here then that this opens up different avenues, and so therefore people have got a wider choice to answer their ultimate questions. So you've got the supermarket shelf. Instead of just going to your, what have you got? You've got the Church of England, or maybe wider, you've got Christianity. No, with all this immigration, you can go to the shelf, you've got Buddhism, you've got Islam, you've got Rastafarianism, you've got Sikhism, you name it, you've got it with immigration. And so the idea with this one is, you could say that this enables greater opportunities to pursue this basic good. Okay, moving on to the requirements of practical reason, and staying with support of immigration. Well, equality, and so you can say, well, the basic goods apply equally to all people. So therefore you're allowed to be self-interested, in other words, look after yourself. But of course, then you've got that requirement. If you're going to look after yourself, basic good of equality applies to all. So you're looking after the good of others as well. Shouldn't neglect the needs of immigrants. So we've got to have we can't just be looking after ourselves. That's equality. Okay, community. Should foster the common good of the community. So the basic goods are about allowing all individuals within a community to flourish. Now, slightly questionable, this one. If we consider the world as a community, then we must help others flourish by allowing immigration. The slight problem with that one is, I would want to suggest that if you're talking about the world as a community, you've probably just lost the meaning of the word community. Moving on now to look at basic goods that could be against immigration, looking at friendship and sociability. And now this, of course, might look as if, this is one way it's for immigration. But this is where you've got the complexity of it, because if you're being sociable, and that really is friendship and sociability, I mean, it's got to be a fairly small group. The Dunbar number, which is the number of people you can have meaningful relationships with, it's about 250. So if you're being sociable and acting on the interests of one's friends, that group of about 250 people, then friendship and sociability really is limited to the sociability of our friends. That's that sort of idea of community. And again, this is looking at whether you can in any meaningful way talk about the world as a community. And of course, this is then saying, well, actually, no, it doesn't include people that we don't know. Immigrants are by definition those outside. And so friendship and sociability might look as if it's one which is just automatically for immigration, because you're being friendly and sociable to the immigrants. But of course, you could say, well, no, actually, friendship and sociability is to my close friends, and these immigrants might actually break up that friendship and the community and the sociability in which I live. And so therefore that would be arguing against immigration. The aesthetic experience, you can speak glowingly in terms of the wonderful richness of aesthetics and culture that are brought in, but also you've got the potential for it just swamping the local cultural identity and whatever unique aesthetics it might have in terms of local art and poetry, etc. So therefore you've got that's reducing the opportunity. And so again with Finnis, it's not easy, and you've got ones here where you can use these to argue against immigration as well as for immigration. And again, you've got to be looking at whether you're looking at one or two Australians joining the community, or whether you're looking at 10,000 Bangladeshi Muslims migrating into Britain. A community, this is one of the real crunch ones as you look at it, allowing immigration, and this again particularly mass immigration. It's incredibly important to be looking at what scale. Are we looking at just small numbers? What sort of cultural and linguistic and religious differences are there? So you might want to look at the Australian, the Pole, the Bangladeshi Muslim. You know, that would be sort of three characters to hold in your mind. And are you looking at a few families? Are you looking at 1,000 of them? Are you looking at 20,000 of them? You know, so that's, you've always got to have that in your mind. And allowing mass immigration, you know, well, it unquestionably causes breakdown in society. Local services unable to cope if you suddenly get an influx. So in the, I wouldn't say recently, I'm trying to think when it is now, it's probably over the last 10, 20 years, when a lot of Poles moved to Britain, particularly over on the east coast, and suddenly from just being completely sort of monoculture white British, you then suddenly found these schools were completely unable to cope with these huge increase in numbers, and not just increase in numbers. You got all these Polish children where Polish was spoken at home. There was no Polish spoken in the teaching fraternity at all, and so you've got major problems there. And that, you know, and again, this is whether it's mass or small scale. And so this is saying that actually you want to maintain community. The only way to foster the common good for a community is to reject immigration, because there's no question about it. If you live somewhere which is you're a member of the out group, you're not going to be accepted. Going back to Birmingham as well, it's a wonderful example of lots of. I lived in the Irish community. I think I was the only non-Irish white in the road. There's some Afro-Caribbeans lived there as well. But the result of that was that the other whites in the road, I was a Brit. This is in the 70s, so we're at these were Southern Irish, and we call it the Troubles. The IRA was still blowing things up in particularly in England at that time, and you know, they just weren't interested because I wasn't one of them. I was you know, wasn't Roman Catholic, I wasn't Irish, and you know, the little local corner shop, it used to sell, I don't know, 2 or 3 daily Irish newspapers. I think the shopkeeper was the only Irish person who I ever spoke to in that in the 2 years I lived there, because the rest of them basically just ignored me. And so there's a good example, because I was actually a member of the indigenous community. Okay, I'd moved to Birmingham, but I was a white Brit, but I was a white Brit who felt pretty alienated from the road in which I lived. Now that gets magnified a million times if you're some elderly, you know, you're some 80-year-old English woman who's lived in Balsall Heath. She was, you know, born there, lived there all her life, and she finds that actually she's then living in, I'm talking about the Irish community. I mean, they were, you know, they were pretty similar to me, but you know, you then find you're an 80-year-old woman living in a Pakistani Muslim community, and if your only means of transport really is walking, then the limits of your walking doesn't take you outside this completely and utterly foreign culture in which you're living. And so those are some of the, you know, as you're looking at immigration, again, this comes right back to whether this is mass or whether it is small scale, and the gap between the immigrants and the indigenous population. And just a few final points to round off Finnis. Don't forget that Finnis is very concerned to have a pretty clear overlap between the moral, in other words, the personal values that individuals live by, and the legal obligation, the law, which is put in place by the government. And he sees that you've got to have, if you've got an effective legal system, it's got to be not completely coterminous, but a huge overlap with the moral. And then he sees that there is an obligation to follow the rule of law, which means that whatever the law is on immigration, then that's just what you accept. But it's not about the personal. The law is what the law is saying. That's not necessarily saying the same thing as about which an individual should relate to the immigrants who they come across. And very importantly, Finnis's lists must be applied to both the people who wish to enter a country, so you apply the list to them, but also, very importantly, it's got to apply to the indigenous population. And when you're doing this, of course, you've got those different lists and you're applying it in this way to this very complex situation. That's why you end up with something which does not just immediately throw up a very simple solution. So it's you know, this isn't something that the smart 13-year-old is going to be able to work out. Okay, we now move on to Hoose and his proportionalism. It's probably simpler than Finnis, but it's still subtle. It's still, you know, we're still a long way from the smart 13-year-old being able to work it out. It needs a lot of information. It needs to start with what does natural law produce? What rules are produced when it's applied to immigration? And then the proportionalism bit is when you look at some of those results of immigration, you look at the rule that's thrown up when you apply your natural law. Are there circumstances where you can look at that rule and think, well, that's actually going to produce a pretty bad outcome, therefore there might be a proportionate reason to override that rule. We need to start then with the rules. There's no point in talking about proportionalism unless you've got rules which you are looking at wanting to break because you can see the consequences of following that rule. So let's start then. Catholic theology has always been supportive of immigration, and then you've got this Pope Francis quote from 2017. Every stranger who knocks at our door is an opportunity for an encounter with Jesus Christ, who identifies with the welcomed and rejected strangers of every age. Aquinas' natural law can also be seen to support immigration because it supports the primary precept of preservation of life. And so therefore, as you go into this, the default position is one of immigration. The moral rule should be immigration is a good act. And so if you're a proportionalist, your default position is accepting immigration. And it's only when you are looking at the consequences that you are in a position to start saying we need to explore this in a bit more detail, because that doesn't look as if it's going to work out well. Okay, for this one, let's move away from discussions about the UK and my rambling anecdotes about Birmingham, and let's look instead at a relatively poor country, looking at whether it's going to receive immigrants flooding in. So this is mass immigration that we're looking at here from some neighbouring country that's got a war in it. And let's look at this one where you've got Sudan, which is now split. You've got South Sudan and North Sudan. There's not quite sure. I think at the moment it's sort of a peace, but only just. But it's one of these chronic conflicts which has just dragged on for years and generates lots of refugees. And so the picture there is South Sudanese refugees there turning up in northern Uganda. And we're not just talking about one or two of them, we're talking about huge numbers of these people fleeing South Sudan. And we're looking then, I mean, Uganda's not a wealthy country, and so you've got a situation here quite different to looking at immigration into the UK. And so let's explore this one from the perspective of proportionalism. Okay, let's start with morality. Well, very straightforwardly, Catholic theology is just about helping immigrants. That is a good act. Then we'll look at value. Don't forget value within Hoose's framework, as this is all the reasons why some non-good and evil act can be carried out in a particular unique situation and be justified as a right act You know, the intention's loving, consequences will create agape, the action will uphold other theological, deontological rules. So that's value. So what have we got here? Some of the immigrants may bring the war to the new country. That's quite common. You just bring all these people in, and the war moves over the border, and that, to state the completely obvious, breaks the natural law primary precept of order in society. That would lead to the violent deaths in the new country. So I'm stating the completely obvious. 10 Commandments there: do not murder. And the leader of the receiving country has to consider agape love for his own people. They're already poor and can't really afford to support a mass influx of immigrants. Okay, let's look at disvalue to remind you what that is within Hoose. That's all the reasons why this non-good, evil act in this particular unique moral situation may not be justified as a right act because it breaks theological, deontological rules. The intention is not agape based, and it will create bad consequences. Okay, so disvalue here then, fairly obviously Catholic theology. Helping the immigrant upholds natural law, primary precept, preservation of life. And so it's not helping the immigrant is therefore a bad act. Supporting the immigrants gives greater chance of them reproducing rather than dying of poverty, disease or famine. Again, stating the obvious really, natural law primary precept of reproduction. And accepting the immigrants is the most loving agape intention towards those immigrants. Okay, so the conclusion. Well, we can't come to a conclusion. It's not something you can come up with in the abstract, really, a situation as complex as this, because it depends on the likelihood of different outcomes. And this, of course, is the teleological aspect of proportionalism. You've got a basic deontological system. You trundle along, you follow the rules. You keep following the rules until you suddenly, the wise person looks at the situation. So here would be the president and his government, and he looks at this and he says, well, the rule is what we would like to do is accept these immigrants, but dearie me, if we do accept these immigrants, look at the potential negative impact that would have. So that's that teleological aspect of proportionalism. So the more danger there was to the receiving country, the more would give a proportionate reason to overturn the natural law and then reject the immigrants.